Hey, how's it going everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to change 4 out of the 5 rear control arms on your BMW F2x and F3x vehicles. Now this isn't a job that you should really have to do often. There's a lot of people that never end up replacing these at all. So if you're doing this because you've bought a really old vehicle that actually needs it, or you're upgrading to some performance parts with something like monoballs instead of these rubber bushings here, then this is going to be great for you. So with the car up in the air, we have to use our 17mm and take our wheels off. And then underneath the car, we'll need to remove the 4 10mm nuts that hold this bottom cover up. So here we are in the wheel well looking at the rear suspension, and you can see there are 5 arms creating this multi-link setup. Starting from the lower front, we have the trailing arm. Above that we have the traction strut. Then going rearward we have the wishbone, and finally at the rear we have the tow arm, and then all the way at the bottom we have the camber arm, which is the only arm out of this that we're not going to replace. So let's get a little bit closer look at what we're going to be working with. You'll notice that some of these arms have mounts on top of the subframes right in front of us. Right here's the traction strut mount. Over on the right a little bit we have the wishbone mount, and these are just sitting right here in front of you. You think, oh, this is going to be so easy to do, they're right here, but really the working space sucks, and even more so on the passenger side, where you have a big old tube coming right in this area for the fuel tank. So yeah, you're not really going to be using any power tools. It's going to be hand tools, mainly like pass-through wrenches, ratcheting wrenches, that type of stuff, because the clearance here really isn't that great. Also of particular difficulty are the bolts holding the traction strut and wishbone to the wheel carrier itself. You can see here one's pointing in kind of towards the drive shaft, and the other one's kind of on top over here. Once again, not a lot of working space, and what I found is with these you may have to adjust the position of the wheel carrier, so put a jack underneath the rotor and lift it up to the height you need to get the clearance you need in order to work with these, and it may not be something as obvious as all the way up or all the way down. Now with some of these arms, BMW says you need to get a new alignment, and others of them you don't really need to because they have fixed lengths. So for example, right, the trailing arm and the traction strut and the upper camber arm, those have fixed lengths and are not adjustable, whereas the lower camber arm, which we will not change, and the rear toe arm have eccentric bolts on them. So I'll go ahead and I'll mention which ones BMW says to get alignment with if you change. And I'm going to start off going front to rear, and we're going to start off by replacing the trailing arm, and then we'll do the traction strut, then the wishbone, and lastly the tow arm. So here we are under the car looking at the trailing arm, and this one you can see access to it isn't too bad. We just have a bunch of 18mm bolts and nuts. You will want to take note of the direction of travel of these bolts and nuts. So the bolts enter from the rear and point forward, and the nuts go on the forward side. So we'll go ahead and undo these nuts and bolts and remove this arm. So if we look at the rear trailing arm, you'll notice, right, it has this hollowed out kind of U shape in the OE arm, and BMW says, to make sure that this open side of the U points down towards the ground when you install it. And of course, right, this open channel over here goes into the bushing on the wheel carrier, and the other end goes into the subframe mount. Now, because these are very different in length, because I want to be able to drive the car right after so I can get to the alignment place. So my goal is going to be to make this the exact same length as the original arm. And so what you can kind of do to aid that process is if you take your original bolts and you kind of just put them through, you can see that they protrude out of the other side. So what I'll do is I'll just place this ball joint in there, and then I will spin the center collar and lengthen the assembly until this new Megan arm is the exact same length as the original one. And I'll know that I get there because this other side over here that is not on this bolt going through will go through. So here we go. Now you can see that this bolt is going through here and going through there, so now these holes are the same length. And then I'll go ahead and take my jam nuts and I'll just press them up against this main adjustment collar by hand, just so it doesn't move around while I'm installing the part. So I don't recommend trying to get you know, heavy torque on the jam nuts and the assembly when it's like this, because when you do that, since the ends are unsecured, they'll rotate as you try and as you apply force on the jam nut, and so that'll put these a little bit out of alignment. So you know, just do it hand tight so that this thing isn't going to move. And then once you've got it bolted to the car, then you can go ahead and take your 21mm wrenches and tighten the jam nuts. I did ask Megan Racing if there was a torque spec on these jam nuts, and I never received a reply. So you know, get them to where you feel is tight enough. They're not going to back off or loosen up. Okay, now I'm back under the car and I'm going to go ahead and put this arm back up into the subframe mount. Remember, the bolts enter from the rear of the car and point towards the front. And then I'm going to do the same down here and get this around the bushing. And the assembly or the wheel carrier might move a little bit after taking out the old arm. So like, for example, right, you see I'm having a little bit of tightness getting the bolt to go through, but it's I can still thread it in, so I'm probably going to have to thread this through both sides. And then once again, you know, as I was mentioning before, sometimes we may have to adjust the height of the wheel carrier itself to get everything to align. You know, you can also adjust the length of the arm itself to get everything to align, but then you're stuck at, well, you don't remember or you don't know what the original length was for the stock arms. So then you have that problem. So I'm just going to do it this way, get these bolts through, and then I'll get these nuts on. So before we put final torque on this control arm, I want you to take notice that I've placed my jack under here and I've actually lifted the rear wheel assembly. And the reason I've done that is because BMW says when you apply final torque to the bushings, make sure that the wheel assembly is at normal ride height. And so that is, you know, if the car was on its wheels on the ground, where this wheel assembly would be in relation to the body of the car. And the reason why you want to do that is rubber bushings have a normal resting point or natural position. And well, if we, you know, put final torque on them while the wheel assembly was all the way, you know, at full extension, well, that would be their new normal resting position. But obviously that's not what it should be. It should be when the car is just resting on the ground. So I've placed the wheel assembly at normal resting position, and then I'll go ahead and torque those 18mm nuts and bolts. So I'm back under the car again, and now that the wheel assembly is at normal position, I can go ahead and torque these bolts and nuts to 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds. And if you're wondering why I'm bothering to do this, because these new Megan arms have monoball bushings, which actually don't require you to be at normal position when they're torqued. It's because this right here on the wheel carrier is a rubber bushing. And aside from the camber arm itself, which I haven't touched, this is the only other rubber bushing left after swapping to these Megan arms. So I'm going to torque this at normal position, and the rest of them I can leave the wheel carrier at full droop because they're monoballs and not rubber bushings anymore. So now that both ends of the control arm are secured and torqued to their final torque spec, now would be a good time to tighten the jam nuts on the assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and take, you know, my 21mm open wrenches and just tighten those jam nuts. Okay, next we'll move up to the traction strut. And so you see the subframe mount over there, and then down below here we have this bolt with a triangular plate attached to it, and that's what secures the arm to the wheel carrier. I've actually left my jack under here because at the position I have the wheel right now, there's actually a little bit more clearance to access this bolt than with it at full droop. So I'm going to go ahead and use my 18 millimeter. Both of these are 18 millimeter, and undo those to take this arm out. So with that bolt, you might think it's easiest to access it from the top and, you know, coming out here and having your wrench in here and working it this way. But actually, I find that if you go underneath, you have a lot more working space. And you can see just the end of my wrench right here. So go ahead and, you know, if you can loosen it from the top, great. Otherwise, go under to the bottom, because you will just have so much more working space, so much more room for you to take your wrench and, you know, get a lot more swing. So when you're working on these control arms, you may find it beneficial to unhook your parking brake line. So it's just here, and you just pop it right out of this little hook, and then you can move this line around as you're trying to, you know, wrench on things. For the subframe bolt, you can see it's easy enough to just get your tools in this way. On the passenger side, though, there will be a lot more limited access because we have a tube for the fuel tank going through there. So I have the arm out, and I'm not sure if you can make it out very well, but here's the wheel carrier, and you can see it's got kind of a concave section to it. And if we look at the control arm, you can see that the bushing that goes into it is also conical in shape, and it fits right in there. So when you replace this arm, if you're using an OE arm, make sure that the curved sides of the bushing and the wheel carrier line don't accidentally, you know, put the flat side up against there. So here's the new Megan arm I'm going to put in, and you can see, like, just like that OE arm, one of the monoballs has a curved side to it, and that's going to be the side that goes into the wheel carrier. And you know, I've got the Megan arm on the OE arm because I've done that method where I put the bolts through and adjusted the length so it's the same again, in order to try and not have too much of an alignment issue after swapping this in. So this is the bolt that's going to secure that traction strut arm to the wheel carrier, and you can see it's got this triangular plate at the end of it. BMW wants you to get new bolts of these every time you use it, and then these will be torqued to yield. So you'll torque it to the 100 Newton meters or 80 or 75 foot-pounds, and then go an additional 90 degrees. And the orientation of this triangle, when you bolt it up, it does not matter. Now that the traction strut is in, I'll go ahead and final torque this to 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds. So here we are looking at the triangular plate bolt that goes into the wheel carrier for the traction strut arm, and you can see, like, there's really terrible clearance here, and you know, I can't fit a torque wrench with a socket on it, otherwise I'll hit the sway bar there. So what I've actually done is I've used a pass-through socket with a crow's foot and then attach my torque wrench to that. So the torque spec on this bolt is once again 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds, but if you're using a new one, also go an additional 90 degrees. So now we'll do the wishbone arm, or the upper rear camber arm, as Megan calls it. And the first thing we'll actually want to do is we'll want to remove this clip, which holds the wires for the wheel speed sensor and the brake pad sensor. So here is that clip that goes around the upper wishbone, or the upper rear camber arm, and you can see, like, these are the tabs that secure it to the arm itself. So if I just push that together, it just snaps together. And the easiest way I find to remove this is not actually pushing down on the tab, but it's like prying up on this part up here. So I take my pick tool and I get into the side, and then I pry it up. I pry this part up while it's on the arm, and then I'm able to pull the tab out from it. And then on the bottom side of this piece, you can see we have a bunch of these different capture parts here, and those are what secure the wheel speed sensor and the brake pad sensor lines. And these, you know, they just clip on the other side, so they come off very easily. As you can see, I'm just undoing them very easily here. So, you know, if you want to release the lines first, you can go ahead and do that. But you know, I usually just take the top off and then release the lines afterwards. So here's a perfect example of just how much tension these bushings are under because they're not at their normal resting position. So I'm going to finish undoing this bolt here, capturing the wishbone arm to the wheel carrier. And when I do that, you're going to see this arm go popping up because the bushing all the way in there, right, its natural resting position is up higher, and right now the suspension is down at full droop, and so it's going to want to pop it back up. So here we go. So now you can see, right, this is the natural resting position, and this is where this arm would be if it if the car was, had its wheel on and was on the ground. So this is why it's important when you torque these bolts down to do this at the normal height, unless you've got monoballs, which these Megan arms do, because those don't have a natural resting position and are able to freely rotate within their housing. Once again, you'll notice that the side of this arm or the bushing that interfaces with the wheel carrier is conical again, and there's a matching conical indentation on the wheel carrier, and it's also one of those triangle plate bolts. And once again, when this is torqued down later, the triangle doesn't have to be indexed to any particular orientation. So now we have to undo the subframe mounting side of this wishbone arm, and you're looking at it straight on and you're thinking, oh, I can just do it from this angle, but it's actually fairly difficult, and there's not much room to maneuver the wrench. You don't have very much working angle space, so it actually is easier to attack it kind of from the bottom for this particular bushing. Now I'm ready to put the new wishbone arm in, and BMW says, for these particular bolts, for the ones that go that thread into the actual wheel carrier itself, don't use an impact on them. Not that you could probably fit an impact in most of these to get them out with anyways, but yeah, that's just some guidance BMW says. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in here, and I'm going to get this triangle bolt just started to thread in and aligned, and then I will go ahead and work on the subframe mount side after this is just hand threaded in a little bit. Now I can put in the subframe side. Remember, the bolt goes from the front. Now that both the inner and outer sides of the wishbone arm are secured, go ahead and take your 18 millimeter and torque these to 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds. And if you're using a new one of the triangle plate bolts to secure to the wheel carrier, go an extra 90 degrees after hitting 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds. Okay, back under the car, and just torqued the wishbone bolt to its final torque of 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds. And you'll notice that I have another one of these funky torque wrench setups, right? I've got a crow's foot on a pass-through socket, so I could get some standoff from the subframe, because the subframe curvature prevents you from using a regular socket on the torque wrench. Like, it's just too long, and the torque wrench head interferes with the subframe, and you can't get the socket all the way on. So this is what I've done with that. Also, if you look at how I have the crow's foot on the torque wrench, it's at a 90-degree angle from the torque wrench head, and it has to be at 90 degrees. Otherwise, the torque that's set on the torque wrench isn't actually the torque that's applied to the crow's foot. So just keep that in mind. Then you can go ahead and put this clip back on the arm to secure the wires down there, or if you're using an aftermarket arm like I am, a couple of zip ties will do the trick. So now we're on to the last arm, which is this toe arm up here. And one thing I want to point out is, if we zoom in here, to the eccentric bolt that controls the toe, you can see, like, the last place I did alignment, they put a witness mark here. And using this paint pen, I'm actually going to put 2 more little witness marks, because I want to try and maintain the same alignment I have now when I put the new Megan arm in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put 2 more little witness marks, so that hopefully I can get everything realigned when I put that new arm in. So back here is a T14 screw, and this is what controls the eccentric adjustment of the toe arm. So obviously we'll need to spin the nut off of that, and use a T14 here to probably unthread this from the subframe. So now I'll use my 18mm as well as my T14 to undo the bolt securing the tow arm to the car. So here is the eccentric bolt washer system for the tow arm, and the camber arm is pretty much the same. You can see the slots there in this washer and the cutouts on this bolt, so that this washer can only go on the opposite end of this bolt a certain way. And when you turn this T14, it spins the eccentric washer, and this is what adjusts the tow. Now I'll go ahead and put this new tow arm in. So I'll have to take the eccentric bolt, right, and make sure I can get that through on the other side. Then I'll put the subframe side in first, get the eccentric bolt through, and then I'll rest this over here on the camber arm. And then I'll go ahead and grab that triangle bolt and just thread this in to the wheel carrier just a little bit. And then we'll start by securing the side with the triangle bolt. Note that BMW says don't use an impact on this since it threads into the wheel carrier itself. I have an electric ratchet here, so not an impact. And once again, it doesn't matter what the orientation of this triangle plate is. And then this will get final torqued to 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds. And if you're using a new bolt, go an additional 90 degrees. Now we can go to the inside screw mount, and this is the one with the eccentric toe adjustment. So what we will need to do here is we'll need to take the eccentric washer, and we need to put that over the bolt. So find the clocking, make sure it goes in between here, and then we can take the nut and just get that started, just so it's like up against the washer here, but not clamping everything super tight. Now I've got my ratchet with T14 on in the rear, and I'm turning the eccentric bolt so that I can reline up the witness marks on my washer over here, and hopefully, maintain the same alignment. And now that everything is aligned, I can go ahead and set this to final torque, which is once again 100 Newton meters or 75 foot-pounds. Now we can put our bottom cover back on, and then using the 10mm nuts, resecure it. And these just have to be hand tight. Don't forget to resecure your parking brake line after you finish your work. So we'll just snap it right back into its little hook, and that little white marker denotes where this hook should sit on it. Now we can put our wheels back on and secure them with the 17mm bolts.
So after I finished the rear control arm swap, I went to VT Motorworks in Pleasanton, California to get the car aligned. And let's focus here on the rear left and rear right numbers, because if you recall, right, I tried to make the new adjustable Megan arms match the same lengths as the OE arms that I took out. And looking at these numbers, I would say that I was actually fairly successful. If we look at the camber, on both sides, my negative camber only increased by about 0.2 from where I had it, or even 0.1, so really not that much at all. And then the toe, which has that eccentric washer bolt that I put paint marks on so I could try and maintain the same toe as before. I absolutely nailed it on the right. On the left, it was a little bit off, but it wasn't anything terribly drastic, so it absolutely was not unacceptable, and I could have driven on this a little while, not really had to worry about it. So this just goes to show you that if you do a little bit of work with a new adjustable arm to try and make them match the OE arm lengths, you can get pretty close without horribly ruining your alignment. And then if you're just swapping in OE arms, then just try and make your witness marks on the eccentric bolts and washers and try and adjust them the same as before.